I watched Purdue's spring game last Saturday on April 13th, about 6 days ago. So some may say this video is late to the party. However, we're not only going to be talking about Purdue's spring game today. I want to tie in what I saw on the spring game to my overall thoughts on Purdue entering the 2024 season. My opinion on the Boilermakers has wavered, and only January, February, March, we're in the middle of April now. We're only 3.5, 4 months in to the 2024 preseason, and like a broken speedometer, my meter on Purdue is swinging back and forth. Of course, not from 0-12 to 12-0. Purdue is absolutely not going 12-0, and I would be very surprised, as would many of you, even those of you who, like the win total suggests, are picking Purdue to have a losing record this year. Do not think the Boilermakers would go 0-12 and lose in every single one of their scheduled games. But I started off the preseason thinking that Purdue would take a step forward and either go very close to becoming bowl eligible, pardon me, or they would reach bowl eligibility and they would not get into a bowl game like Minnesota did last year, all due respect, through the academic progress rate, or how Rutgers combined with a Texas A&M opt-out did in the 2021 Gator Bowl, but that they would actually get 6 wins, that Ryan Walters and his staff would take a step forward. And then, after looking at the schedule, after looking at Purdue, their returning production numbers not being high, well outside of the top 50, also outside of the top 50 in preseason SP+, which is very reliable. And Purdue's schedule isn't just tough in conference. They have a tough out-of-conference slate, too. They have to play Notre Dame, who is slated to be a top 10 or near top 10 team this season. And Oregon State isn't what they used to be under Jonathan Smith, but they still have some Power 4 now talent, and they were a Power 5 team a year ago. They still have some pieces left, some good coaches, and Purdue has to play them on the road. And those 2 games are back-to-back after a bye week that comes after their opener against Indiana State, which is probably the only easy game on their schedule relative to Purdue's roster, their performance last season, their returning production. Every statistic indicates that Purdue might be one of the worst teams in the Big Ten this coming year. Every statistic, except for maybe their incoming transfer portal class. Purdue, I think, nailed the transfer portal in that winter window. They earned several good commits, many of whom did play in the spring game, including 2 players in C.J. Smith and Nyland Green from Georgia. Purdue got 16 commits in their current transfer portal class, which is 19th in the country. 1 is a 4-star, 14 are 3 stars, and one of them is not ranked. But they got transfers from the Big Ten, from the SEC, an offensive tackle from Notre Dame. They also got some MAC players and players from lower levels from the FCS. And they lost Nick Scorton to Texas A&M, Garrett Miller, tight end, Texas A&M. They did lose some big players. We cannot forget about Deion Burks either, who's joining one of the best wide receiver rooms in Oklahoma. So they lost some, but I think that they overall had a net benefit from the 2024 transfer portal. They brought in more than they lost. But they also are losing players on the offensive line, running back Tyrone Tracy, Sanusi Kane, Cam Allen, and other players on defense, just by them not having the required eligibility anymore and them trying their hopes out in the NFL. But then I watched the spring game, and this is where things change for me. I'm watching Purdue's spring game, and while there are some drops in the receiver core, and while the secondary has a few busted coverages early on in the spring game, wide open Hudson Card just flings it deep, and there's no one on Hudson Card's left side of the field, and I forget who the receiver was. It might have been CJ Smith, who I think is going to be the best receiver on this team. But said receiver caught it, waltzed into the end zone, no problem. And that was the first and biggest play, or one of the only big plays, and the first big play of the spring game. That showed some explosiveness in the passing game, but more importantly, and I just got choked up there because running on 5 hours of sleep. But anyway, the trenches were impressive. The offensive line looked good. They were able to protect Hudson Card for much of the game, and they were able to open up some holes in the ground attack as well, I think particularly on the outside. And the defense really impressed me as well. I loved the defensive tackle play that I saw. Purdue's defensive tackles dominated the interior. The ends did well. The linebackers, in Will Helt, he had a pick six. They were good in coverage. They were good at getting pressure. And the secondary showed moments of greatness. They did have some busted coverages and got deep a few times, but they also had pass deflections, moments where they had phenomenal coverage. And I overall thought it was a good spring game. That spring game, and I know it's just a spring game, but Purdue looked fundamental. They looked balanced. They had depth, I would say, at every position. And by depth, I don't mean Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon, Alabama, Texas depth. Even USC or Oklahoma or Clemson or Florida State depth. I mean depth relative to the talent and skill level of their starters. If Hudson Card goes down, his backup can likely do nearly as good of a job as he does. Same with the offensive line. Same with the defensive line. I don't know about the wide receiver core or tight end room, but trench play, QB play, and really the entire defense, as I think the defense dominated the game or controlled the game in one aspect or another. And also at running back, Jaheim Merriweather looked good. Reggie Love III looked good. Devin Mockabee played. So there's depth at running back, even with Tyrone Tracy Jr. leaving. Those are very good places to start. And I think at wide receiver and even tight end, Drew Bieber being a redshirt junior and Max Clare and George Burhan being sophomores. And then at wide receiver, CJ Smith, Cam Brown, and Nyland Morset transferring in. So that's 3 incoming transfers. And Andrew Sawinski, Jaden Dixon-Veal, and Jamal Edrine. Those are all juniors or older in terms of eligibility. So there's potential at those positions to have depth as well. I thought that the spring game was good, and while that doesn't totally change my opinion on Purdue, it does move it. It moves the needle in a positive direction. And Purdue's rival, Indiana, saw some encouraging things too, but that's for a video that will be released tomorrow. I want to react to the Indiana spring game that occurred yesterday at the time of this recording on Thursday. But that's on Purdue's rival. We're here to talk about the Boilermakers right now. Purdue's offense. I liked what I saw in the spring game, particularly again in the trenches. The offense, I think, has a high upside and a good offensive line, but they are inconsistent. The rushing attack was very hit or miss. On the interior, I thought that they struggled, although at times they were able to kind of power through. It was more so the outside run, the more explosive plays. I would say that the 5-10 yard runs were more successful on the outside and just in general than, let's say, the 1 to 4 yard runs. And you may say, well, duh, that's just simple math. But Michigan had very few 5 to 10 yard runs last year, and their rushing attack statistically wasn't the best in the country, but in terms of 4th down conversion and in terms of short power running, they could get it done, and they were one of the better short power rushing offenses in the country, if that makes any sense. Michigan could convert almost any 4th down against any defense last year. Just look at what they did against Penn State and Ohio State running the ball. Very few explosive runs, but just enough to control the clock and to extend drives. And if Purdue's offense can figure out the interior run and they can get some of those more 1 to 4 yard gains, which are more consistent, more sustainable than a 5 to 10 yard gain, they're in good shape with the fact that they looked good on the outside. I think that CJ Smith, who's pictured on your screen wearing a Georgia uniform, I just couldn't find any good photo of him in a Purdue uniform at the time that I made these edits. He's going to be a star. He is fast, he's electric, and I think that he'll fit well in this offense with Hudson Card and Graham Harrell's air raid. And Hudson Card has time in the pocket. And Purdue, while I don't think, again, as I mentioned earlier when we talked about depth, I don't think they have the best defense in the world. This defense looks much better than last season's defense, which we'll talk about this more when we focus on that side of the ball, but they allowed 30.4 points per game. The offense last year scored 23.9 points per game, which was 87th in the country. I don't know how much the offense will improve this year compared to last year, but I can say that they'll have a good center, just like they did last year, because Gus Hartwig comes back. Their running back room should be about the same. I wouldn't be shocked if receiver was as good, because yes, Deion Burks leaves, and that hurts a lot. But CJ Smith is a high-ceiling player, high-level talent. He transferred out of Georgia because Georgia was deep, and Georgia has a near elite to elite stable of receivers, not because CJ Smith is a bad player. CJ Smith just needed a chance to shine somewhere else, and I think Purdue is the area to do that. I think that quarterback play will take a step forward, at least to some degree. Hudson Card looked overall impressive. He had some misses, and last season he was outside of maybe Northwestern's quarterback, Ben Bryant, the best quarterback in the Big Ten West, which isn't saying much, but hey, it means that he's not terrible. I don't think Hudson Card was a terrible quarterback last year. He had 200 rushing yards, a few thousand passing yards, and again, probably the best quarterback in the Big Ten West outside of maybe Ben Bryant, and Ben Bryant didn't stay healthy the whole season. Card had 2,387 passing yards, 15 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, a 123 passer rating, and a QB rating, a quarterback efficiency rating that I believe was top 100. Again, not saying much, but at least this wasn't Iowa or Minnesota with Kaliakmanis or Nebraska with little Heinrich Harburg and Jeff Sims. And I mean, Chubba Purdy was efficient, but I don't think he's as good as Kalen or Raiola, who are the true freshmen who are competing for that starting job down in Lincoln. And Altmaier was atrocious too. And Hudson Card played well at Texas, highly recruited out of high school. This will be his second year in Graham Harrell's system. And this will be a test to Graham Harrell and this offensive staff and also head coach Ryan Walters, in the sense that year 1 to year 2 is where you should face a pretty big jump, because you're doubling the time that your players have been under your command, under your development, under your regime. I think that wide receiver play overall will determine the offense's success, because I think Hudson Card he's a proven quarterback. We know what he is, and by proven I don't mean in the sense of, oh, he's good, sort of, because I think he's an average quarterback, maybe below average at worst, and I would say good at best, given that he does have a high ceiling. But we know who Hudson Card is. We don't necessarily know, because of how good Deion Burks was last year, we don't know who Jaden Dixon-Veal is to the fullest extent, or Jamal Edgerine, or CJ Smith. And wide receiver, you have multiple starters. At quarterback, you have one starter, so it's easier to focus on the QB room because there's fewer players to focus on. So who can emerge at wide receiver? And if 1 or 2 players emerge there, or maybe more, but it's safer to bet on 1 or 2, and the wide receiver room is just as good as last year, with quarterback play and the offensive system likely taking a step forward or a few steps forward, look for the offense to improve. And I think that Devin Mockabee will learn from some of the mistakes that he made last year and become an even better player. Gus Hartwig and Marcus Mboa returning on the interior. I think that given how talented the interior of Purdue's O-line is, and I can't even believe I'm saying that, but Hartwig's a good center, Mboa is a good guard, with how that defensive tackle unit played, I wonder how good that D-line is. And it could be good. That defense could face a jump from last year to this year like Illinois did from 2021 to 2022. And that defense that Ryan Walters, genius DC that year, he commanded that defense, was number 1 in passer rating allowed and points allowed per game as well. And also CJ Smith. I think those 4 players will likely be the offense's best players. Before we go any further, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. And thank you to my patrons for sponsoring this video and channel. Thanks to Crash2488 for being a Heisman member. Thanks to Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Lane, and Connor Little OH for being All-American members. Thanks to Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being all conference members. If you want to support the channel and give in an extra way to help the work that we do here on College Football with Sam, the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, you can check out my Patreon page and sign up as an all-conference, all-American, or Heisman member via the link in the description or at the top of the pinned comment. And if you want to get merchandise and represent the channel rather than join the Patreon page, you can check out my merchandise page and purchase some merch via the link in the description or at the top of the pinned comment. And by the way, if you're a Heisman member, one of your perks, and Crash2488 is going to get his merchandise soon, as soon as I possibly can, which I don't know if that'll be technically soon, but I'm going to try and get it to him. He gets free merchandise because he's been a Heisman member for 6 months. So that's one of the perks of joining the Patreon, especially as a Heisman member. So please check that out. Thank you very much for your support, and let's get back on topic. The defense. There's less intrigue with the defense. This is typical of the superior side of the football, unless they have a ridiculously high ceiling that you wonder if they can tap into that. I don't know if this defense, and I don't think this defense has an insanely high ceiling, an elite ceiling, but they do have players with an elite potential. I think Nyland Green at corner, Dillon Thienemen at free safety, I think they have an elite ceiling. And I don't know about anyone else, but I think Kytron Jenkins has a great ceiling. And I think that Cole Brevard is a great interior defensive lineman. And Will Helt, played as a true freshman, is going to be a true sophomore. If he can take steps forward, he can be a big contributor as well. I look at this defense and Ryan Walters being a defensive guy, I have to think that they'll take steps forward on this side of the ball. And I thought that well into last year, into last season. I'm thinking Purdue's probably going to improve on this side of the ball entering this season. And I thought that early in this preseason, and I've thought this way for months now, and I feel like the spring game confirmed that in a way. Purdue's defense looked more complete than the offense. They looked disciplined, physical. The defensive backs blew some coverages, but other times made some pass deflections and big plays. And the front was strong against the run. They did well in pass rush. I know I said the O-line predicted Card well, but you can tell when trench play overall isn't good. And I feel like that was kind of Indiana's spring game, where the O-line and D-line are just trading massive punches and big plays. Purdue's battle in the trenches was won by the D-line, but there was a complementary battle, almost. There wasn't really a big play that either side of the trenches provided. They were just battling it out. It was all-out war. And that's what you want to see when your own offense is facing your own defense. Of course, in an actual game, you want to see your side of the ball dominate. But I'm saying these two sides are going to be on the same side, obviously, in the fall. And the fact that there weren't big plays allowed on the ground, Card was overall well protected, but Purdue's defense was able to shut down the run. They were able to occasionally get to Card as well. I thought it was an admirable and valiant effort by the defensive line in particular. And Purdue's schedule, they're going to be facing a lot of offenses, plenty of teams who will have good trench play or historically good trench play in recent memory who want to run the football. these teams, whether it's they actually have good trench play or they historically have had good trench play in the past few seasons, are Notre Dame, Oregon State, Wisconsin, Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State. That right there is 6 teams. Half their schedule last year had anywhere from good to great to near elite to elite offensive line play. And Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State have top 10 running back rooms. Notre Dame has an underrated collection of young running backs until Damian Martinez entered the portal, which he'll be a nice get wherever he goes. Good luck to him. Great player. Oregon State would have had one of the better running backs in the country. And Wisconsin, they bring in Tawi Walker and Ches Malusi returns. If they can stay healthy, they'll have a great rushing attack. But I think Wisconsin's focus is more so their offensive line. Just should be good everywhere. And Nebraska, while they haven't historically had great trench play, either offensively, which I'm mostly focusing on here for Purdue's opponents because we're talking about Purdue's defense, or defensively, Nebraska has not historically had great trench play. But entering this season, their offensive line brings back a lot of their production. Their center, Ben Scott. They bring in Micah Mezcua from Florida at guard, and he should be one of their best interior offensive linemen and offensive linemen overall. And they have a deep running back room. I mean, Dante Dowdle from Oregon and Gabe Irvin Jr., Ramir Johnson, Emmett Johnson. Just stacked running back room. They could suffer an injury or two there, and I hope they don't. But they did last year, and they still had a good rushing attack. And they do have, I think, enough mobility at quarterback, whether it's Kalen, more so him. Raiola's probably more mobile than a Cade McNamara or Kyle McCord, but not as mobile. They'll be able to throw in some wrinkles overall. Nebraska will. And Northwestern returns Cam Porter in much of their production. And Michigan State with Jonathan Smith and Tanner Miller at center and Nathan Carter at running back. I'm just looking at this schedule, and a lot of these teams, non-conference or conference, should be able to run the football and rather well on an average basis. So it's going to be very important that the trench play that we watched from the interior of that D-line, I've said time and time and again, this is why Penn State and James Franklin, outside of James Franklin's inept game decisions, have not won the Big Ten since 2016. It took them having a red-hot run and honestly, by statistics, a fluky season in 2016 to win the Big Ten, because their interior trench play has never been their strong point. They finally, Penn State under Franklin, finally had a first-team All-Big Ten offensive lineman. He was a tackle. He wasn't a guard, wasn't a center. And that's good, but guards, centers, and defensive tackles are some of the most important positions in the Big Ten that no one talks about because they don't light up the statistic board. But they're critical. They're absolutely important in the Big Ten Conference. Interior trench play dominates. It's why Michigan has won the Big Ten for 3 years in a row, because on an average basis for the past 3 years, they've had the best interior trench play. They had the best combined guard, center, and defensive tackle play by a mile in 2023 and 2022 in the Big Ten, and some would even say the country. And in 2021, they were up there nationally, and they led the Big Ten, but not by the same margin they did in 22 and 23. We'll see if Ohio State can do that this year. Maybe Penn State can, since they return all their defensive tackles. Michigan returns their defensive tackles, and they bring in Josh Preby, a good guard from Northwestern. Wisconsin could do that. They return guards. Nebraska returns a lot of interior players. And there are more schools. But look at Purdue. Cole Brevard comes back at defensive tackle. And in Purdue's 3-4 defense, he's their only defensive tackle. But they also have Joe Anderson coming back. Mo Amonodi, I hope that's how you say his name, backup nose tackle. He comes back. And Gus Hartwig and Jalen Grant and Marcus Mbow are veteran interior offensive linemen. So perhaps Purdue, while I doubt they would dominate the interior trenches in the Big Ten, perhaps there's a good chance that they'll be up there in interior trench play, and then that would bode well for the Boilermakers. Overall, Purdue is 96th in returning production this year. Like I said, way outside the top 50. They're 86th in preseason SP Plus rankings. And this video is a little longer than my other spring game reactions because I'm combining what I see in the spring game with my overall thoughts on Purdue. This is kind of a spring game meshed with 2024 early season preview. So, of course, it's going to be longer than a simple spring game reaction like I'm doing for every other team except for Wisconsin, who doesn't have a spring game. And for other teams like Ohio State, for example, Michigan, and teams that impress me in their spring games, of course I'm going to talk more about their spring game performance and reference it probably until we actually kick off. But Purdue had, relative to my expectations, the most impressive spring game I've seen so far. Their trench play looks good, especially on the interior, and that bodes well for Big Ten games. And the fact that their tackles did well on the outside run and pass pro, exterior trench play is important too. Ohio State with Chase Young in 2019 and Larry Johnson more so being known for his ends rather than his tackles on the defensive line, they dominated the Big Ten, especially on defense, and they were scary there. So when I say interior trench play is important, I'm not dismissing exterior trench play. Interior trench play is more underrated because sacks are mostly generated by ends. I mean, an elite defensive tackle, unless you're Ndamukong Suh and you're generational, or Jalen Carter, unless you're those type of players, same with Jordan Davis from Georgia in 2021, unless you're those type of players, you are not going to receive highlights as a defensive tackle. You're not going to. You're more likely going to receive that as a defensive end where you can get sacks and light up the statistic board and get more tackles and be more involved in multiple different positions on defense. A tackle kind of has one sole job, and it's stopping the interior run, and you get to the quarterback if you can. And maybe that's not the best assessment, but from what I can tell, that's true. Mason Graham is an exception to that rule of not being noticed. The country's taken notice of him and Kenneth Grant, but again, they're elite. But having tackle play and having defensive end play that are good, that's necessary as well. And at least from offensive tackle, I'm encouraged by what I've seen from Purdue. The defense is improving. That combined with a solid O-line gives hope. The skill rooms have questions, whether that's the backfield on defense or the backfield and the exterior boundaries, the receivers on offense, or the quarterback position. Those have questions, but they didn't look bad. They didn't look great, but they didn't look bad. They looked average on a mean basis, on a mean median basis. And that with a good defense and good trench play, I think is encouraging. C.J. Smith, Max Clare, Nyland Green, and Will Helt, I think are players to watch. Players that are likely to break out, could break out, or that Purdue, I think this is the case especially with Max Clare, players that they will need to perform well. If Clare can be a great blocker and a great receiver, adding on to the pass protection, adding on to the run game in blocking, and adding on to the receiving game, that would be so huge for Hudson Card, Ryan Walters, and that entire staff. Purdue faces a tough schedule in 2024. They play Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, and Notre Dame. But if they can reach bowl eligibility given their schedule, I think this coming season will absolutely be a success. And I think that is very doable. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I did give a shout out in the middle of the video. I guess it just felt really natural to me. That's not normal, but take from that what you will. I did give a shout out, but I'm going to give it again here. Thanks to Crash2488 for sponsoring this video as a Heisman member, for Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Lane, and Connor Little OH for sponsoring this video and channel as All-American members, and Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell. Thank you for sponsoring this video as all conference members. Check out my Patreon page and merchandise store via the links in the description or the pinned comment. And please like this video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your reaction to Purdue's spring game and your prediction for their 2024 schedule down in the comments below. Have a great day, guys, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.